And so they're trying to kind of figure out like a time of death, because it seemed like he'd been there a good, right there in the direct sun, by the way,
Right.
on the beach, in an era before sunblock, or sunscreen. That would have been a long time. I'm surprised his skin was blistered.
And we are live once again. Welcome back, everyone who's listening to the podcast. This is Solvable Mysteries Podcast, episode number 6. My name is Juras. I'm joined by my co host, Glenn. How are you doing today, my friend?
Fine. Really happy to be talking about this case today.
Yeah, well, today we are going to be discussing the Tamam Shud, or I should say Tamam Shud case, otherwise known as the Somerton Man Mystery. So, Glenn, if you don't mind just giving us a brief introduction to what actually happened.
Yeah. So, it's interesting how, like, some cases in different areas, regionally are really big, but then aren't as big outside. But, for instance, maybe the Michael Negreed episode we did last week was kind of a big regional case, but, someone in the UK wouldn't have heard about it. But this is an interesting case because it's something that happened in a fairly remote area of the world, in Adelaide, South Australia. Yet it seems to be just internationally followed, and it's one of those cases I think that's been around long enough that, um, interest just keeps growing, and more clues keep coming up. So, I'm not going to recap every single clue here, but I think most people that are listening to this already are familiar with the case. But the outline is that, a dead man was found, on a beach in South Australia. He was well dressed. Even his shoes were polished.
Yeah.
There was not really any identification on him immediately. The reason why the case is called Tamam Shud is because, there was a scrap of paper in his pocket, a fob pocket of the man's trousers, it says here in Wikipedia. And, so there was just this phrase Tamam Shud, which means, ended or finished. I'm assuming.
In Persian, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess Farsi, maybe ancient Farsi.
Hmm.
And it turns out it's a famous phrase from, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which is a famous 12th century poet, Omar Khayyam. Um,
Yep.
so this is interesting because this is like one of those books that, like, I had not heard of, like, since 10th grade English. Because, here, in, the United States and in England, one of the famous English poets, I think it was I can't remember if it was Wordsworth. Anyway, he had
Hmm.
there was a famous poem that mentions, the Rubaiyat or Omar Khayyam. So,
Oh wow.
it was
I'm
yeah, it
I'm
was kind of funny to
actually
hear it.
I'm actually surprised that you've actually been given this knowledge in high school about the whole poet and the book, because the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, like the only time I've actually heard about this book and about this Tamam Shud wordplay was when I was researching this case. We didn't really listen. We weren't really taught about these this poet in particular, so I didn't even really know that this was a famous enough literature. So yeah.
Yeah, that I mean, it's a good point, and it's kind of one of those kind of moments I laughed a little bit about because I'm like, okay, either this book was really popular, back in the era, like this was still, barely out of the radio era, and it wasn't television barely existed at this point, so people had to entertain themselves in a lot of different ways,
Yeah.
back in the old days. So I'm like, okay, well, how plausible is it that this what seems like fairly obscure? I do wonder if maybe at one point or different points actually in history, this book had become kind of like a popular book to have around. Um, sort of like the Kama Sutra or
Yeah.
something like that, where it's like it's kind of trendy to have it in your bookcase. Maybe you never actually read it. Um,
Have
it's
you actually
possible.
have you actually read it though? I'm
Me?
actually curious.
No, no, no. I mean, like I said, it was. I think it was Wordsworth or somebody.
Ah.
Somebody had a poem. Somebody had a poem that they wrote right after like an opium trip. Um,
Oh
there's a
wow.
famous English. Yeah, yeah. There's a famous English poet, Romantic era poet, I think.
Yeah.
That wrote a. He had a massive opium trip, woke up and wrote an entire poem just from scratch, like instantly, and never got to finish because somebody came and rang the doorbell and interrupted him. But he mentions, anyways, he mentions this book. So,
Yeah.
so he has this thing and this weird kind of clue in his pocket, and that's it. Like, there's nothing else on him. They don't know who this person is. He looks like somebody that would be missed. So we talked about this in some of our past episodes that the unfortunate reality is sometimes, like a lot of times crimes happen or people go missing and we never really find out about it because it's somebody that, maybe lives at the fringes of society, is marginalized. Not
Right.
this guy. You wouldn't think so. He definitely looked like he was in good shape. I think he was in it said exquisite health. They thought he was about 40 to
40 to
42.
45. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, right in that range.
Yep.
Which was significant later on when they tried to compare him to other people. But
Mm.
yeah, no one seemed to know how he got there. There were some witnesses that thought that they saw him moving at some point in that spot, that he shifted his position. So they're trying to kind of figure out like a time of death, because it seemed like he'd been there a good, right there in the direct sun, by the way, and
Right.
on the beach, in an era before sunblock, or sunscreen. That would have been a long time. I'm surprised his skin wasn't blistered to hell from
Well,
just.
he was constantly getting like barraged by mosquitoes. At least that's what one of
Oh
the
yeah,
yeah, like some of the witnesses have said that they didn't really want to move the body because they saw the mosquitoes flying around the man, and they were just thinking that maybe this guy was drunk or he's just asleep or passed out. So they just sort of let him do his thing,
so
just lie there. Yeah.
so that's an interesting. I'm glad you called that out because that's an interest. I never thought about that. Do mosquitoes fly around something that's dead already? Because mosquitoes
No
follow
idea.
carbon dioxide. Yeah, I wonder. Look at
Oh.
that. I think they follow carbon dioxide
Mm.
from animals, mammals, etc. And then I wonder, would mosquitoes bite a corpse? Huh. It's interesting to think, to
Hmm.
try to figure out time of death. But anyways, the fact that the
Right.
mosquitoes were around him and he wasn't reacting to that didn't seem like he was in a good way. Um, so long story short, it seems that the police and probably the other folks involved in the case came to a conclusion at some point that perhaps this person was some kind of spy because they were having a really hard time identifying who he was. Nobody reported him missing. When they did actually, what happened was, interestingly, the book that this Tamam Shud phrase came from turned
Yeah.
up in a taxi cab. Um, and then when they had this book, and this book, by the way, we'll mention this later, has been lost since then. So that's a little bit suspicious that they just lost this piece of evidence for this famous case. But
Are you talking about like the exact book that
yep,
this paper scrap has been torn out of?
yeah, yeah, the
Oh, so
exact book.
they actually managed to lose the original book?
Yeah, yeah, they quote unquote lost it. So that
What?
yeah, that kind
Okay.
of feeds into some, you might call them conspiracy theories that I have about this case and what was
Yeah.
really going on there.
I
So
bet I bet it does because how do you lose that? Like, isn't
it,
this like the only isn't this like the only significant piece of evidence left?
yeah, I mean the other, there were some other weird things, like he had like a bus ticket that he would have had to buy between a
Yeah.
certain time because I guess the ticket itself, the number or whatever, was only sold during one person's shift and not, anyway, they were fairly certain that he seemed to have bought a bus ticket or someone had bought a bus ticket and put it
Yeah.
on his body. Um, they had this book that they recovered, which it was the exact book that the phrase had been cut out of, and they were able to figure out some evidence from that. So they had like a phone number of a woman who lived locally.
Right. I
Um,
believe I believe she lived 400 meters away from where the man's dead body was found. So That,
Yeah.
at least for me, that definitely leads me to believe that this woman, she probably knew what happened, or at least she knew the Somerton Man, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that was that. So that's what let's cut to the
Yeah.
chase with it. Was that yeah? That basically they 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 had noticed when they here's a crazy thing.
Hmm.
They seem to have done such a great job investigating this case. So here's a case in point. They have this piece of evidence, the book, the
Yeah.
phrase is from, and they're like, oh, look, we can like examine it so closely, even back then, 1948, that we can actually see the outline of where somebody had used it as the backstop for like a piece of paper they were writing a phone number on. And they said, oh, look, there's an actual indentation in like the book itself, like the cover or the pages or whatever, of this phone number. Let's call the phone number who lives there. Oh, here's this lady. This is where it gets really weird. So uh,
Yeah,
this
this
woman,
this is pretty much where it gets weird, but at the same time, like, you know, this is where it also gets really interesting, and I believe this sort of like the phone number, the woman who, you know, was the owner of that phone number. I definitely have her, you know, on my radar in terms of, you know what I'm saying.
yeah,
Like, she probably
yeah,
knew something. At least that's, you know, what my conclusions are currently.
yeah. I think you're right. I think she might be. It's funny because I think in some ways she might be like a very low level pawn, but I think she's also, like you said, the unifying factor of this case, and
I believe
maybe
so. Yeah.
yeah. So her name was Jessica Thompson,
Yep.
and she said she never. Well, okay, a couple things. One, the first thing is when they showed her the photo, she almost passed out. So like she could probably and but said she didn't know the guy. So I guess she could say that just looking at photos of dead people makes her feel weird. But like that photo is pretty innocuous. It just looks like he's asleep. Honestly, he looks like he's awake. I have a hard time believing he's dead, but he is.
I
You
bet
know what I
he
mean? He looks.
I bet he was dead, you know,
Yeah.
but I definitely get what you're saying, you know. This photo, you know, it wouldn't make someone, you know, super shocked if they saw
Wretch,
just
right?
a, you know, just a random person, you know.
So
So
let's take that super emotional reaction and just put it aside for a second, or stick a pin in it, and just
right.
yeah, keep it really as one of our main clues here. But that was not, and mind you, her reaction also points to maybe somebody who's not a super experienced spy, because you would think that somebody who's a hardened spy
Hmm.
might do a better job of self control. So it seems like if she is in part of some spy network, she might be like a relatively new or fringe person who doesn't.
Right. Maybe she was
Yeah,
just, you know, there is a theory that the this woman, Jessica Thompson, she actually, you know, was sort of in a relationship with this man. So maybe the Somerton man, he was, you know, the actual spy, and Jessica was just tagging along with him because, you
yeah,
know,
yeah. Just
something
he's a
like that.
good-looking guy.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems successful. And there's other things that seem to
Or
indicate that he
or
had a
maybe
nice run.
right, or maybe the case could be stated that maybe Jessica didn't actually knew that the man was dead, and she was actually shocked to find out that, you know, her colleague spy or something like that is dead. So maybe she was
Exactly.
caught off guard. Maybe she was not aware that this man, whoever he was, you know, if she knew him, that he was dead. So maybe that shocked her.
That's perfect actually, because yeah, you've actually fleshed out a couple of my downstream theories from this
Mm,
perfectly with that,
yeah.
highlighting that. Yep. So exactly, she's shocked, but she says no, and she tells some whole other story about, well, I never gave a copy of that book to anybody, to this guy. Well, anybody look like this guy, but there was another guy that during the war, and so here's the interesting thing is that like apparently she had maybe had like a relationship with some other man, who she supposedly gave a copy of the same book to, and then he actually turned up later, and there was a bunch of weirdness with this other guy, the other guy who they thought might have been this guy until they found
Yeah.
him alive, because it was getting confused there. Yeah, so this other guy turns up. Hey, I'm alive. I'm not the guy that turned up dead, even though it looks like we were born around the same time. Um, but just so you know, like I still have the book. Everything's fine.
Yeah,
So
and the book didn't have the torn out,
right,
phrase out of it. But to that point, I sort of feel like this book was probably fairly easy to come by. Especially for like Spies or something like that. So they could have just bought a new one or something like
yeah,
that,
yeah.
and then just say that this is I'm not connected. My book is fine.
So here's where it gets weird. Is I it says here in Wikipedia that
Yep.
the Jessica asked that her name not be kept as a part of a permanent record or release her details to third parties. And I think this is what I find I don't know whether they find it super strange or not. So they actually agree with her and they're like, oh, you know what, you're right. We want to protect your privacy and not make you look. We don't want to cast aspersions upon your character. So that's one of those things where you think about it like World War II is an interesting time in kind of Europe and a good chunk of the world's past because you had so many people, whether they were fighting or not, moving across the world to different places and sometimes like essentially having whole other lives in like somebody
Yeah.
from like north
Exactly. Yeah.
right, yeah, someone from North America ends up in Germany or Japan or an occupation somewhere and has a
Yep.
whole other set of experience. So case in point, I'm sure it was probably the same for Spies. I know for a fact from reading some books that during this period the spy world was extremely busy and they were all definitely racking up the frequent flyer miles in terms
Yeah.
of
Like I
getting
bet,
around.
given the tensions, between like the Cold War powers and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think it seemed like a lot of these kind of wartime relationships happened that maybe didn't turn into anything post-war. So maybe the cops were kind of looking at it that way, and hey, we know this stuff happened. All of us, something happened during the war.
Yeah.
Our lives were disrupted. We're putting them back together. We're forget about it. But here's the thing. Everybody was a little squirrely. Her reactions are pretty squirrely. And this was actually during there's something called Project Verona. Is it Verona or no? No, I'm saying no. Sorry, Venora.
Yeah. Venora. Yeah.
Venona. Wow, I'm saying it really wrong. Venona Project.
It's okay, man.
Wow. Yeah, I'll mangle that one some more.
I mean, just a quick note to our
Yeah.
listeners: if you sort of sense that myself and Glenn are a little bit sleepy on this episode, then you are not mistaken. Especially, at least in my case, I'm definitely a little sleepy, I would say. So, yeah, just a quick note, I guess.
Yeah. No, we'll make it through it.
Of course
So
we will. I mean,
to
this is
to
still
the
fun, but
good
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. Let's make it to the fun stuff
So
already. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So Venona was a counterintelligence project by the United States.
Yep.
So what happened was we started to realize that our former ally, the Soviet Union in World War II,
Hmm.
had, of course, become also our geopolitical competitor, and that there had been a lot of spying even before the war on their behalf. This is also during a kind of the big anti-communism wave that started happening in the United States that reached kind of religious levels at one point. So unfortunately, it went a little far, but it was where people started taking this seriously. It's also where you start seeing some major figures get arrested in the United States for things like stealing nuclear secrets. So, I say this because this is serious business when you find a spy. And I find it very puzzling that this is first they supposedly to protect the honor of some woman, they are kind of abandoning a spy lead. So
Yeah.
and there's so many other clues and so many other weird things. I mean, for instance, like they think that somebody would have had to move the body there because it looked like he'd essentially convulsed and vomited to death or come near to it, and there was no vomit on the suit. The suit was in exquisite condition. They found some other luggage. They even found this fake ID, which is another thing that, is fake in that the name on this kind of official government document from, I think, Australia
Yeah.
doesn't actually align to any known person. So if I were to just get down to it and say, like, what I think is going on here.
Hmm.
So I have a couple theories. Okay, so theory number one is, and they all have to do with spying at this point. Theory number one is the Soviets were detecting that this Venona project was starting to uproot a lot of like their established spy rings,
Hmm.
and they decided to do some cleanup. So while Jessica Thompson is kind of a low-level pawn who maybe never knew anything, they just said, here's some books, give it to some people, and
Another,
that's it.
yeah, another note
Okay.
quickly to
Yeah,
mention about Jessica is that her daughter, after Jessica passed in 2007, her daughter came out and publicly stated that she believes there was a connection with the Somerton Man and her mother Jessica, and that Jessica Thompson, she actually spoke fluent Russian, so that's
yeah.
definitely something of note.
And then the other guy, she gave a copy of the Rubaiyat too.
Yeah.
Um, he it was really weird because he had some kind of like what seemed like a relatively non-spy related job post-war, yet there was a lot of rumbling
Wait,
about
what was he doing again? Was he?
he was like a manager of like a bus depot or something, or it was
Oh
something
yeah,
like
yeah.
yeah, didn't sound like spy work. I mean, it's unless it's a cover job. But then there was a lot of talk about him both pre and post war, or during the war and post war, having some kind of intelligence work or intelligence connections. So it's like once again this Jessica Thompson person is involved
Right.
with people with intelligence connections. So that does not seem like it'd be a coincidence. There was also on top of it, there were two different important strategic sites nearby. So there was a rocket testing range nearby, and there was a uranium mine nearby.
Around like the whole Adelaide vicinity, right?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So there was a good reason for a spy to be in town. I
Oh,
really think maybe the Soviets got spooked, and so theory one is Soviets get spooked, and they pick certain people who have been around too long and maybe know where the bodies are buried, except figuratively speaking, and they say, you
yeah.
know what, we're just going to do a little cleaning, and what it looks like this guy was poisoned, um, and it was using a poison that at the time was not really detectable, and that's not really that that hard to believe because even now there's a lot of poisons that are very hard to detect. Um,
Yeah.
let's just
Especially nowadays, yeah. But back in the day, there were a lot of poisons that could not be detected. So another thing worth of note in terms of this case is that this man's internal organs were enlarged, basically, which definitely, at least the experts say that it definitely does not correlate to a natural death. So foul play essentially had to happen. There's no other way around it. At least that's what the experts say.
right, right, yeah, yeah. So I mean, and then they said he was in good health. They didn't really
Yeah,
mention anything like like any artery clogging. I mean, because I mean, my
yeah.
thought was what why not just heart disease? But it doesn't seem like that
Right.
was at
So
all. Yeah,
the last thing that this man ate was a pasty, which is essentially like a bun, a sweet bun. But I don't think that could kill
right.
a healthy man. I just don't see how that would be the case.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Nope.
Um, so yeah, option one is maybe the Soviets do a little cleaning, but the Jessica Thompsons of the world, A, maybe will be missed, and B, are not important enough to warrant, that kind of exposure. So I think what's weird is though, why leave this person out in public? So is that a warning also from the Soviets to Jessica Thompson's that like keep your mouth shut, don't mess up, and then unfortunately they just it backfired on them because some dummy left the book in a cab, and because just Jessica Thompson only was caught by luck. Like the only clue they had was that phone number
Yep.
that was what I mean, and who knew that number would be pulled from the what I mean, the indentation on a book. It seems like a really really rare thing to happen. So I think that the Jessica Thompson was never meant to be found. She was meant to see the warning and know to like shut down her activities or keep her mouth shut. and then unfortunately it got more embarrassing. That's one theory. Um,
Yeah, because let's say the book originally belongs to Jessica, and somebody just sort of takes the book from her or something like that, and they just cut that little scrap of paper that says Tamam Shud. They sew the little scrap of paper into the unidentified man who is found dead clothes, and then that information sort of leaks, and that's sort of like a subtle way to send a message to only the person that would actually understand what was happening, because the general public wouldn't to the general public. It's just a fascinating thing to find like that little scrap of paper, but to the people who actually know what that scrap of paper means or where it's actually from, that's like sending a message to them, and the extra notoriety that this case gives just makes sure that the person that needs to you know uh, get the point across to just finds out just finds out about the case. I know I'm blabbing a little bit, but I'm sure you know what I'm trying to say here, right?
yeah, no, totally. And yeah, I mean, I have a hard time believing that, let's say, the NATO side of things. So, whether
You mean like that the spies were from
yeah,
Britain or something like that?
well, more that like the investigating authorities. So something like this, I can imagine. Not
Ah,
only not, not
yeah.
not only did Australia, I'm sure they had CIA and FBI and MI6, etc.
Hmm.
People getting involved, at least on some kind of consulting basis, because it seems like what I if my theory is correct and it is part of some Soviet spy network, they would all everybody would be extremely interested, because we were all working together on a lot of these initiatives, and we had a joint defense pact. But also, like I almost think that, especially the way some of this evidence, like for instance, I said the book that they found has mysteriously gone missing in the intervening years.
Yeah.
And that stuff happens, I guess, but it seems pretty weird with something connected to what might be a spy case. Um, I also find it weird that um, like we found out a lot of other things about famous spies in the past when the Soviet Union was disbanded, essentially, or broke up, and during the Yeltsin years, we were on kind of better, a little bit more friendly relationship with
Yeah,
Russia.
on better terms, definitely. Yeah, with
Yeah, yeah,
Yeltsin, yeah,
with Yeltsin, yeah, for a little while until Putin.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah,
we were kind of friends, but I mean, a lot of stuff was going on back then too. But they showed us a lot of files, and we found out a lot of extra information about kind of these famous spy cases that, like, even like the Rosenberg's case in point, where
hmm,
like, oh no, like, yeah, they were spying, or at least the husband was, um, and everybody seemed to be involved in some way.
right.
So like, I find it weird that this has never turned up. And I don't know if it hasn't turned up because there's nothing about this person, about this case, or if it hasn't turned up because it did turn up in the files when they were turned over, and they reclassified it on our side, because we do know who the person is. We've been keeping our mouth shut, and it was used. Perhaps it was also used to try to embarrass the Soviets. Like, what if let's say the NATO side, the Australian side, let's say
Yeah,
their local CIA kind of version of the CIA, they find this guy. They get what they want out of him, but they keep him in relatively good shape. And then maybe he dies during the questioning, maybe he dies during the interrogation. He's been drugged, maybe, to try to tell the truth. Um,
right.
he dies, and they're like, you know what? Let's leave this dummy out there and see who reacts. And lo and behold, it kind of like snowballs a little bit, where they just accidentally find these other clues, like Jessica Thompson. Yeah, I don't know. It seems strange to me that we haven't
Yeah.
heard about it, from
Well,
these other sources.
yeah. So basically, in terms of like theories, like all I have is spy theories. As like what what would be your like main theories for, say, if the scrap of paper was never found, the book was never located, and Jessica Thompson was never in the picture. What would you think about it then, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, I would just think it was like an unfortunate missing persons case, or maybe someone that
Yeah, something
had
like
wandered
that.
off in like early onset dementia, maybe. You know what I
Right,
mean?
something like
Yeah,
that. So basically, this little scrap of paper changed absolutely everything. So this case
yeah,
became one of the, I believe in Australia, it's probably the most popular unsolved case, I would say. I mean, Australia has a lot of like missing person cases. There's a lot of things that we could discuss or cover in the future episodes, but I feel like this is the most famous uh, mystery in Australia's history, basically. And yeah, so this one little scrap of paper just sort of snowballed into like this huge phenomenon, and it's still going on to this day. The case is still unsolved. As I've said, there are so many theories, but like the ones that actually really sort of make some sort of sense to me is are like the spy theories, and the fact that Jessica spoke fluent Russian. At least that's what her daughter stated. Seems to indicate
yeah,
that there has to be some sort of a Soviet Union connection going on right here. Especially as you mentioned before, the Adelaide area was surrounded with nuclear plants, so this is definitely a place where some sort of spy activity was going on. Even though if this man who was found dead at the shore, even if he wasn't a spy and this was actually an accident, I'm certain that there were spies, other spies, looking around, taking a closer look at these nuclear power plants, because nuclear anything was very very like a sensitive subject back then, when the nuclear weapons were like still developing and everyone was trying to get an edge. So this is definitely a competitive area, and some sort of spying was definitely happening one way or another. You know what I'm
yeah.
trying to say?
Oh yeah, yeah, and they were playing for really high stakes. I mean, the secrets were literally leaking out right around that time. I mean, it was around the time we were working on the H bomb, and we'd already lost. There was a lot of like leaking of competitive information about even
Right.
just bomb design. So even it's not just like understanding how it works, but like because either us or the Soviet Union, we would often test designs that did different things, and some of these designs were like on the cutting edge of theoretical physics. So sometimes the scientists were very surprised by what happened. It wasn't what they anticipated. There was actually a famous test that happened where the bomb was way bigger than they
Oh,
thought it would be, and it almost blew up everybody that was monitoring the test.
where
Um,
did this happen? Do you know any more
uh,
details?
I'll have to go back and watch the movie Trinity and Beyond. Is a great
Oh,
recap of all of
okay.
our nuclear tests. It's an excellent movie, but yeah, I can't remember, and it actually breaks it down case by case. But yeah,
Hmm.
it was I think in the 50s or 60s.
Oh
It was a
wow.
really big one like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think you're right. It's so funny because yeah, otherwise like this is just some another unfortunate soul lost, but for
Yeah.
that little scrap of paper that went down this whole other rabbit series of rabbit holes, and then to just update it to right now at the conclusion of our episode,
Yeah.
because there are all these questions about whether or not he is the biological father of Jessica Thompson's daughter, who seems like she'd had
Yep.
a bunch of a bunch of relationships around the same time. So there was some
Yeah.
question on the
Mm-hmm.
parentage of her
Yeah, yeah.
daughter, and
And
then yeah,
I've read somewhere that, or I don't know, I've seen something about like the fact that Jessica's son, he had some sort of similar ear condition that the Somerton Man had.
yeah.
Have you heard anything about that? Like a really, really rare ear condition, especially within like Caucasian men, and like the chances of that being just a coincidence is really slim, I guess.
It was like 2%. Yeah, so I saw that quote in the Wikipedia. It was, yeah, that he had. gosh, I'll have to find it, but it was something weird, like the top part of your ear is deeper than the bottom part of your ear.
Yep.
And then they had that quote about it being 2% of Caucasian men. So I had to Google that because I was like, okay, well, is there like a frequency distribution for other, like is it,
Yeah.
are they just saying, you know what I mean? Are they just saying that just for Caucasians, or are they saying that for all? They only have the data maybe for
Yeah.
Caucasians. Maybe that's what they're saying.
Yeah,
But
yeah, especially like back in the
so,
day. Yeah.
so the funny thing is, almost all of the other results that come up in Google for that have
Yeah.
to do with this case. So that's a little bit funny. Um,
Uh, you
you know what I
mean
mean? Like,
like all the Google search results in regards to like the condition, everything sort of
yes.
links to this case? Yeah, well, that definitely seems like the condition is really rare. If they don't have anything better, to talk about, maybe about the
In this
whole,
case.
yeah, maybe like try to discuss like the whole ear situation rather than about this case. But I mean,
Right.
I don't blame him.
Yeah.
I think this case is fascinating to say the least.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, I think that the most recent was there were some attempts in the past to have the body, because they actually made some effort. The local, I think it was like
Hmm.
um, the local like game makers, like the local bookie association. The licensed book association, I should say, actually paid for a funeral for this guy, so they know where he's buried. He didn't end up in like an unmarked grave somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, so they want to exhume him, and I think they just this year, just this month, I think, got permission um, to finally exhume his body and get some actual DNA samples from him, so that they can start comparing him to some of the other folks involved in the case, like the descendants of Jessica Thompson.
Right, but hasn't like the man's body been balmed pretty early on in the investigation? So like any sort of like relevant DNA evidence pretty much has been removed from his body, or something like that.
It's a good question. I'm not sure if you can extract it from the bones or the bone marrow,
Oh
or
yeah, yeah. What am I saying?
yeah,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
maybe that, maybe something like that. But it's a good point. I mean, it seems like they would contaminate it a bit. I'm not really sure what embalming involves, but I think
I
they're
think
hoping to get
yeah.
some hair roots or something out of it. Yeah,
I
it
mean,
would be interesting.
it would be really fascinating if after all of these years, all of this time, they could actually find out who he was, or at least like find people who are related to him. I think that would be a miracle of science, you could say.
Yeah, I think that would maybe actually definitively solve this. It's interesting to point out, at the end of this, that you would think something this old, that like you would say, oh well, surely nothing that old could ever be classified. But what was strange is when I was researching this, I was reading up on like different encryption methods and like how people use books and things like that, for different kinds of ways to encrypt messages back and forth. You'll use like, you'll both have the same copy of the book, so you can refer to different pages for certain words, or for how you encode your words, etc. So one of the Soviet um, cryptography, I guess, like information theory folks,
Yeah.
back from pre-war, his stuff is still classified. His theories. So can you imagine
What?
somebody who, yeah, somebody from like almost 100 years ago? Some of his theories are so relevant to today, that it's classified even now, and that's the case for sometimes I think cases like this, and cases like around, even in this country, there's a bunch of files around the JFK assassination that are still under lock and key, and we can't find out
Yeah.
what's going on.
But
Yeah,
but
which
but like you are going a little bit off topic, but I think that's fine.
yeah,
Wait, don't like those JFK cases like have a certain like time, or like a date where when the files will be like unclassified? Isn't that the case?
yeah. They set a 75-year limit for some of those at the time, I think, post investigation, and then there was a bunch that was supposed to come up, that
Yeah.
then got extended. So that's what's scary, is that date can come up, and then some judge or some government entity can turn around and say, well, for reasons we can't talk about in public, that's still related to something that needs to be kept classified. But yeah, it's extremely frustrating because it's like, yeah, at some point,
People want to know the truth.
the truth. Yeah, yeah.
I think it's important, to provide the truth. I just what do you think? Like declassifying documents, would it cause more harm to the society, or is it something that the government should do? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases, I do wonder where how much they're protecting people. Like, you would want to protect somebody that was involved in a secret operation where
Yeah,
you wouldn't want their family to take the
of
repercussions of
course.
their acts
Yeah,
or something, because it turned out they'd done something, we consider to be really wrong now. But
right.
at the same point, if you're just protecting people because of political reasons, and that's what I worry about. I think like the JFK assassination, which by the way would be that'll be our epic 3 hour show, I guess. But
I bet. Yeah, yeah,
that'll be our Freebird of podcasts. But
yeah.
that one I think is one of the most fascinating ones because there are so many theories around what happened there and why. From the most mundane to like this guy was just crazy and he just took shots at
Yeah.
JFK to all the other interests, and yeah, it's where it gets like really fascinating. So it's same thing for this case. It's like, why? How is it? It seems a little bit weird, given how much they were able to find out immediately. It's like they found out so
Hmm.
many interesting things about this guy, and
Right.
then nothing really else for like 70 years. So that seems a little strange to me. That seems like I think they solved it and they kept their mouth shut.
Yeah. That's actually a nice little wrap up, I guess, to what happened. So yeah, so basically, there are like a lot of different nuances that we could go into in regards to this case, but I believe that, at least I strongly believe that this was, the public has not been fully informed, or I should say, not being given all of the details in terms of this case. So I think something spy-ish definitely was going on, and I think it's if certain governments or certain maybe people in power would want to let everyone in on what actually happened, I think we would already know some more details surrounding this case, because it's just with a case like this that has so much interest, to for it to still be completely unsolved. It's it's definitely a crazy thing for me, and I believe there are people that know the truth, and they unfortunately do not want us to know the truth per se, if
Right.
that makes sense, right?
Totally.
Yep. So yeah, essentially, I think, I mean, yeah, I didn't really prepare to go into like any other details in regards to this case. I guess this just was a quick rundown of what actually happened, and and we also gave our own, like, perspectives on this case. Unless you want to mention some other details, I'm pretty much think like on my end, I pretty much said everything I had to say in regards to this case.
Yeah, same here. Same thing here. I think I was almost a little bit underwhelmed by, I guess, compared to some of the other stuff we've looked at, and I guess maybe sometimes a dead guy on a beach um, doesn't doesn't seem as spooky as things flying through the sky in front of
Oh
jet
yeah.
fighters. But it's been exciting enough. Certainly, that the rest of the world thinks it is interesting. From my perspective, yeah, it is. I think it's the spy portion of things and the lack of evidence
Yeah.
that, to me, yeah, points to maybe the more interesting uh, phenomenon going on around this case. So maybe that's what makes this case special, is it's actually like the tip of the iceberg
Yeah.
for what's really going on under the
Yeah.
surface.
So maybe our listeners could, like, maybe shed some light on this case. Maybe we have missed something. I'm sure we've missed like some sort of interesting details, no doubt. So if our listeners, would be so kind to leave us a comment in the comment section, giving their own theories on what happened, or like some sort of interesting facts, we would more than appreciate it, and we would definitely respond. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So essentially, since we're wrapping up the episode, I guess, yeah. So this was the Summerman episode. The case is still unfolded, and yeah, basically, you can follow us on our social medias. We have a Twitter, we have an Instagram, we also have a Facebook page. We might actually get some more social media accounts in the future. And also, we're in the process of transporting this podcast to more platforms, maybe like Spotify or Apple or iTunes, something like that, So if you don't really enjoy listening to this podcast on YouTube, for say, if the YouTube platform doesn't really work for you, we'll definitely be on other platforms eventually. So yeah, essentially that's that. Anything you want to mention to our listeners before we sign off, Glenn?
No, that's it. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to your feedback and your comments as we continue to go down each new mystery.
Yeah, definitely. So for this week, I guess this is the last episode. We have been contemplating with Glenn to maybe start doing maybe two episodes on some weeks, or something like that. Whenever we have the time, or maybe if some sort of like crucial details of some famous case reappear. So yeah, basically stay tuned. We will definitely get you on the next episode, which should be coming out next week. Not sure of the date yet. And yeah, leave us a comment down below, and we will catch you on the next episode. Take it easy, guys, and peace out.